The desert wind blew across the shattered hills of Tunisia in May 1943. For months, the war in North Africa had raged under a brutal sun. Tanks burned in the sand, artillery thundered across empty valleys, and soldiers on both sides fought in a place that seemed to belong to no one. But by the spring of 1943, the end was approaching. The once feared Axis army in North Africa was collapsing. German soldiers of the Afrika Korps, veterans of years of hard fighting under General Erwin Rommel, now found themselves surrounded. Supplies had dried up, fuel was almost gone. The skies above belonged entirely to Allied aircraft. What had once been a proud offensive force had turned into scattered units trying to survive another day in a war that was clearly lost. In early May, Allied forces pushed the remaining German and Italian troops into a shrinking pocket in northern Tunisia. There was nowhere left to retreat. The Mediterranean Sea blocked one side, and tens of thousands of Allied soldiers closed in from every direction. The desert campaign that had once stretched from Egypt to Libya now ended in a small corner of Tunisia. For many German soldiers, surrender was not just defeat, it was terror. For years, Nazi propaganda had warned them about the enemy. They were told that Americans were brutal, that British soldiers would seek revenge, and that surrender meant humiliation, torture, or even death. Posters, speeches, and military briefings repeated the same message: capture by the Allies would be worse than dying in battle. So when the final order came down to lay down their weapons, many soldiers hesitated. Corporal Hans Müller, like thousands of others, had spent years in the Desert War. He had survived tank battles, bombing raids, and the endless dust storms of North Africa. Now, standing in a long column of defeated soldiers, he waited for the moment when Allied troops would finally approach. Some expected shouting, others expected violence. Instead, something strange happened. An American soldier walked toward the prisoners, relaxed, carrying his rifle casually over his shoulder. He looked at the exhausted Germans and simply motioned for them to move forward. No insults, no threats, just instructions. Then another American soldier stepped up and began handing out something small from a cardboard box. It was chewing gum. For many of the German prisoners, the moment felt unreal. After months of shortages and battlefield rations, they were suddenly being offered cigarettes, chocolate, and white bread. Some soldiers were suspicious, refusing at first, convinced that this was some kind of trick. But nothing happened. No one beat them. No one shouted at them. Instead, the American guards organized the prisoners into groups, checked their names, and prepared them for transport away from the front lines. The shock spread quickly among the captured soldiers. Word passed from man to man through the long columns of prisoners marching toward temporary camps. This is not what we were told. In total, nearly 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. It was one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. German and Italian prisoners filled makeshift camps as Allied commanders faced an unexpected problem. What do you do with so many prisoners? Keeping them in North Africa was nearly impossible. The region lacked the infrastructure to house and feed such enormous numbers of men. The British already held thousands of prisoners, and their camps were overcrowded. American military planners began considering a radical solution. They would send the prisoners across the Atlantic Ocean. At first, the idea sounded risky. German submarines were still hunting Allied ships in the Atlantic. Transporting tens of thousands of enemy soldiers across those dangerous waters seemed almost absurd. But the United States had something that the war-torn nations of Europe did not: space. Vast land, large military bases, and the ability to build new camps quickly. American officials also believed that holding prisoners far from the battlefield would reduce the chances of escape and sabotage. Within months, the plan was underway. German prisoners were loaded onto large transport ships, many of the same vessels that had carried American soldiers to the front. Now they carried the enemy in the opposite direction. For the prisoners, the journey was filled with uncertainty. They had no idea where they were going. Rumors spread across the crowded decks of the ships. Some believed they were being sent to Canada. Others feared they might be taken to remote islands or prison camps deep in the desert. Very few imagined the truth. They were heading to the United States. The Atlantic crossing took weeks. Prisoners slept in crowded compartments, guarded by American soldiers, but generally treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. They received regular meals, medical care, and even occasional time on deck. Again and again, the same thought appeared in letters and memories recorded years later. This was not what they expected. By the end of the journey, the ships approached the American coastline. Huge ports like New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans began receiving shiploads of prisoners. For many German soldiers, it was the first time they had ever seen the United States. Trains waited at the docks. Long military trains carried the prisoners deep into the American interior, across forests, rivers, and farmland that seemed impossibly vast compared to Europe. Cities were intact, farms were thriving, factories roared with production. For men who had left behind bombed cities and rationed food, the sight was almost unbelievable. Across the country, the U.S. Army rushed to build prisoner-of-war camps. By the end of the war, more than 500 camps and branch camps would operate across the United States. From Texas to Wisconsin, from Oklahoma to the Carolinas, thousands of German prisoners would soon live behind American guard towers. In total, around 400,000 German prisoners of war would eventually be held in the United States. For many Americans, the idea sounded strange. Enemy soldiers living inside their country during wartime felt risky. But the U.S. government believed the system could work. And in many ways, it did. But hidden beneath the calm routine of these camps, another story was beginning to unfold. Inside the barracks, the war had not ended. Among the prisoners were loyal Nazis, officers who believed that surrender did not mean defeat. They carried with them the ideology of the Third Reich, and they had no intention of abandoning it even in captivity. In the months ahead, these men would create secret hierarchies, underground courts, and systems of punishment designed to control their fellow prisoners. To the American guards, the camps appeared peaceful. But behind the barracks doors, a silent civil war was about to begin. When the long train carrying German prisoners finally slowed to a stop, many of the men pressed their faces against the small windows of the rail cars. They had traveled for days across a country that seemed endless. Forests, rivers, farms, and quiet towns had passed by in a blur. Now the doors opened and warm air rushed inside. This was America. For many of the prisoners, the first sight was confusing. They had imagined prison camps surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards waiting to punish them. Nazi propaganda had spent years painting the Allies as cruel enemies who would humiliate and torture captured soldiers. Instead, what they saw looked strangely ordinary. Rows of wooden barracks stood on open land. A few guard towers rose above the camp, but the fences were often simple and sometimes barely visible. Trucks moved slowly across dusty roads. American soldiers stood nearby, but they did not shout or threaten the prisoners. The German soldiers stepped down from the train one by one, carrying the few belongings they had left. Many were exhausted from the journey across the Atlantic and the long ride inland, yet something about the camp seemed almost calm. The guards organized them into groups and led them toward the barracks that would become their new home. Inside, the prisoners found wooden bunk beds arranged in neat rows. Blankets were stacked at the end of each bed. There were wash stations, mess halls, and medical buildings. The camp was simple, but it was clean and organized. Soon, the prisoners were marched to the dining hall.
Many expected thin soup or hard rations. Instead, they received trays filled with food that looked far better than anything they had eaten for months in the Desert War. There was white bread, meat, vegetables, and sometimes even coffee. Some prisoners stared at the food in disbelief. Back in Europe, food shortages had already become a serious problem. But here, thousands of miles from the front lines, the prisoners were being fed regular meals that followed the rules of the Geneva Convention. In some cases, the rations were even similar to what American soldiers received. Word spread quickly through the barracks. This is not a normal prison. Over the following days, the prisoners began to learn the routines of camp life. Each morning started with roll call. Guards counted the prisoners carefully, making sure no one was missing. After that, the day unfolded according to a schedule. Some prisoners cleaned the barracks, others worked in kitchens or maintenance crews. Many attended organized activities designed to keep the camp orderly. There were sports fields where prisoners played soccer and volleyball. Some camps had libraries filled with German-language books. Others offered classes where prisoners could study mathematics, languages, or technical skills. To many German soldiers, it felt less like a prison and more like a strange, controlled village. The American government had made a deliberate decision about how to run these camps. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war had to be treated humanely. They were entitled to adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. The United States chose to follow those rules very carefully. Part of the reason was practical. American leaders hoped that if they treated German prisoners well, American soldiers captured by Germany might receive similar treatment. But there was also another idea behind the policy. Many American officials believed that exposure to ordinary American life could have a powerful psychological effect on the prisoners. Instead of punishment, they would experience a country that looked very different from the enemy described by Nazi propaganda. And the differences were impossible to ignore. The prisoners saw trucks delivering fresh food every day. They saw American soldiers casually talking to each other, sometimes joking with the prisoners. They saw nearby farms producing enormous harvests. Outside the camps, American towns lived in relative peace. Children went to school, farmers worked their fields, stores remained open. For soldiers who had left behind bombed cities and air raid sirens in Europe, the contrast was shocking. Some prisoners began writing letters home, carefully describing what they saw. They told their families about the food, the camps, and the strange kindness of the guards. Of course, not everything about captivity was comfortable. The prisoners were still far from home, surrounded by guards, and uncertain about how long the war would last. Some worried constantly about their families in Germany, where Allied bombing raids had become increasingly destructive. Others struggled with boredom and frustration. Days in the camp followed the same routine again and again. Yet compared to the horrors of the front lines, the camps often felt peaceful. In some places, the camps were located near farming communities that were facing a serious problem. Millions of American men had joined the military, leaving farms and factories without enough workers. Crops still had to be planted and harvested. Fields still needed labor. Soon, the U.S. government began using prisoners of war as part of the solution. Small groups of German prisoners were transported from the camps to nearby farms where they worked under supervision. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested vegetables in the Midwest, and cut timber in southern forests. At first, many American farmers were uncertain about working with enemy soldiers. But something unexpected happened. The prisoners worked hard, and over time, the tension began to fade. Farmers and prisoners sometimes shared brief conversations through translators or broken English. In a few cases, farmers even offered extra food or coffee after long days in the fields. For the prisoners, these moments were deeply confusing. They had grown up hearing that Americans were greedy, cruel, and weak, but the people they encountered seemed ordinary, even friendly. One German prisoner later wrote that the experience shattered the image of America he had been taught since childhood. But not everyone in the camps felt the same way. Among the thousands of prisoners were men who remained fiercely loyal to Nazi ideology. Some had been members of the Nazi Party for years. Others were officers who believed surrender was only a temporary setback. To them, the comfortable conditions of the camp were not kindness. They saw it as weakness. Quietly, these men began to organize themselves inside the barracks. They watched the behavior of other prisoners carefully. Anyone who seemed too friendly with the Americans, anyone who criticized the German leadership, became suspicious in their eyes. Small groups began forming within the camp. Meetings took place late at night after the guards finished their rounds. Loyalists spoke about honor, discipline, and loyalty to the Führer. They warned that even in captivity, German soldiers had a duty to remain faithful to their cause. At first, the American camp administrators barely noticed. From the outside, everything looked peaceful. Prisoners worked, played sports, and followed the daily schedule. The camps appeared calm and orderly. But inside the barracks, tensions were quietly growing. What the Americans had created was often called a golden cage. The prisoners had food, shelter, and safety, yet they were still locked inside a system they could not leave. And within that cage, a dangerous struggle for control was beginning to take shape.
At first, life inside the American prisoner of war camps seemed calm and orderly. From the outside, everything appeared to be working exactly as planned. The prisoners had food, shelter, and routines that kept them busy. Guards conducted roll calls, work assignments continued, and many prisoners spent their days playing sports, reading books, or writing letters home. To the American officers responsible for running the camps, the system seemed successful. But beneath the quiet surface of the barracks, another reality was slowly taking shape. Among the thousands of German prisoners were men who had been deeply committed to the Nazi regime. Some were former members of the Nazi Party. Others were officers who had sworn personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. For them, surrender in Tunisia had not ended the war. It had only changed the battlefield. Inside the camps, they began to organize. At first, the structure was informal. Small groups gathered quietly in corners of the barracks late at night, speaking in low voices after the lights were supposed to be out. The conversations were not about homesickness or boredom. They were about loyalty. These men believed that even as prisoners, German soldiers still had a duty to defend the honor of the Third Reich. Anyone who criticized Germany's leadership, anyone who spoke too positively about the Americans, or anyone who questioned the war could be considered a traitor, and traitors, they believed, had to be punished. The American camp authorities had made one critical decision when organizing the camps. In order to maintain order among thousands of prisoners, they allowed the German soldiers to manage many of their own internal affairs. Senior German officers were often placed in leadership roles within the barracks. They helped distribute supplies, organize work groups, and keep discipline among the prisoners. At first, this seemed efficient, but it also gave the most hard-line Nazis an opportunity to take control. Within a short time, secret hierarchies began to form inside several camps. Loyal Nazi prisoners quietly identified each other and built networks of influence. They watched the other prisoners closely, looking for signs of weakness or disloyalty. If someone spoke openly against Hitler, word spread quickly. If someone was seen talking too comfortably with American guards, his name might appear on a secret list. Soon, these underground groups began creating what prisoners later called kangaroo courts. These were secret trials inside the barracks, usually late at night when American guards were less likely to notice unusual activity. Prisoners suspected of disloyalty were brought before these makeshift courts and accused of betraying Germany. The trials were not fair. The accused rarely had a chance to defend themselves. Witnesses were often fellow prisoners who had already been pressured or threatened. The verdict was usually decided long before the trial began.
Sometimes the punishment was intimidation or beatings, but in some cases, the punishment was death. The murders were carefully planned to look like accidents or suicides. Prisoners were strangled, beaten, or hanged in ways designed to hide what had really happened. When American guards discovered the bodies, it often appeared as though the prisoner had taken his own life. For a long time, the true story remained hidden. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred in a prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma. In 1944, a German prisoner named Werner Drexler had begun cooperating with American authorities. He had spoken openly about the Nazi hierarchy inside the camps and had provided information about extremist prisoners. Word of his cooperation eventually reached other German prisoners. Not long after he was transferred to a different camp, several hardline Nazi prisoners organized a secret trial against him. They accused him of betraying Germany and collaborating with the enemy. Within hours, the sentence was carried out. Drexler was beaten and strangled by fellow prisoners inside the barracks, while dozens of others watched in silence. When American guards discovered his body, the truth began to emerge about the hidden system of terror inside the camps. American investigators were shocked. The camps that had appeared peaceful from the outside were actually hiding deep divisions among the prisoners. Some prisoners wanted nothing more than to survive the war and return home. Others remained fiercely loyal to Nazi ideology and believed they were still fighting for their cause. The discovery forced American authorities to reconsider how the camps were organized. Investigators began identifying prisoners who were strongly committed to Nazi ideology. These prisoners were often separated from others and transferred to different camps designed specifically for the most loyal followers of the regime. Meanwhile, prisoners who openly rejected Nazi beliefs were moved to safer environments where they would not face intimidation from fellow inmates. The changes slowly reduced the influence of the extremist groups, but the damage had already been done. Across several camps in the United States, a number of mysterious deaths had occurred before the American authorities fully understood what was happening. In many cases, prisoners had been killed simply for questioning the ideology they had once been forced to follow. For the American guards, the situation was deeply unsettling. They had believed the camps were safe and stable. Instead, they had unknowingly allowed a miniature version of the conflict inside Germany itself to appear within the prison system. It was no longer just a camp holding enemy soldiers. It had become a battleground of ideas. On one side were prisoners who still believed in the Nazi vision of loyalty and obedience at any cost. On the other side were prisoners who had begun to see the world differently after months of exposure to American life. This silent struggle would continue throughout the war, and as time passed, more and more prisoners would begin to question the beliefs they had once accepted without doubt. But that transformation would not happen overnight. For many prisoners, the first real turning point would come not inside the barracks, but outside the camp fences, working side by side with ordinary American civilians in the fields and forests of a country they had once believed to be their enemy.
By 1944, the United States faced a problem that few people had predicted when the war began. Millions of American men had left their homes to serve in the military. Farms across the country suddenly lacked the workers needed to plant crops, harvest fields, and maintain food production. The war demanded enormous quantities of food for soldiers overseas, for allies in Europe, and for civilians at home. Fields still needed to be harvested, cotton still had to be picked, timber still needed to be cut. But the hands that once did this work were now carrying rifles in distant parts of the world. The solution, surprisingly, was already inside the prisoner of war camps. Across the United States, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were sitting idle behind the fences. Many of them were experienced laborers. Some had grown up on farms in Germany. Others had worked in factories or construction before joining the army. American officials began to see an opportunity.
According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be assigned certain types of work as long as the labor was not directly connected to military operations. Agricultural work, forestry, and basic construction were all considered acceptable. Soon, small groups of German prisoners were being transported out of the camps every morning. Guarded by a few American soldiers, trucks carried them to nearby farms, fields, and forests. For many prisoners, it was the first time they had been outside the camp since arriving in America. The experience was strange for both sides. American farmers watched as enemy soldiers stepped down from the trucks and began working in their fields. Some farmers had sons or brothers fighting in Europe against the very army these prisoners once served. At first, the atmosphere was tense, but work has a way of changing things. The prisoners harvested cotton under the hot Texas sun. They picked vegetables in the fertile fields of the Midwest. In the forests of the South, they helped cut timber that would later be used for construction and industry. The labor was hard, but it was familiar to many of them. For some prisoners, the work actually felt like a return to a normal life after the chaos of the battlefield. Over time, something unexpected began to happen. Conversations started. Language was often a barrier, but people found ways to communicate. A few prisoners spoke some English. Some American farmers knew bits of German from their own family histories. Many simply used gestures, smiles, and simple words to understand each other. Slowly, the image of the enemy began to change. One former German prisoner later recalled how the German prisoners worked quietly and respectfully in his fields. At the end of long days, he sometimes offered them cold water or coffee. In return, the prisoners worked harder than anyone expected. In some cases, farmers even invited prisoners to sit on the porch during breaks, sharing simple meals like fried chicken, bread, or fresh fruit. For the prisoners, these moments were deeply confusing. They had grown up hearing that Americans were arrogant, greedy, and hostile toward Germans, yet here they were, sitting in the shade of an American farmhouse, drinking coffee with the same people they had been taught to hate. The contrast between propaganda and reality was impossible to ignore. One former German prisoner later wrote that working on American farms changed his understanding of the war more than any political speech ever could. The farmers were not the monsters described by Nazi propaganda. They were ordinary people trying to live their lives, and many of them treated the prisoners with unexpected kindness. Of course, not every interaction was friendly. Some Americans remained angry about the war and refused to speak with the prisoners at all. Guards were always present to prevent escapes or conflicts, but overall, the system worked surprisingly well. By the final years of the war, German prisoners were working in thousands of locations across the United States. They harvested crops that helped feed the nation and its allies. They repaired roads, cleared forests, and filled the labor gap left by millions of soldiers overseas. In many rural areas, the presence of German POW labor became an essential part of keeping farms productive. For the prisoners themselves, the work brought them into contact with a version of America they had never imagined. They saw busy towns, full stores, and farms producing enormous quantities of food. They saw families living normal lives without constant fear of bombing raids. They saw a country that appeared confident and stable even during a global war. These experiences slowly began to influence how many prisoners thought about the world. Some began reading books from the camp libraries about democracy and American history. Others listened to radio programs or attended educational lectures organized inside the camps. The goal was simple. American officials hoped that exposure to new ideas might weaken the grip of Nazi ideology on the prisoners, and in many cases it did. Prisoners who had once believed completely in the propaganda of the Third Reich began to ask questions. They discussed politics quietly in the barracks. They debated the future of Germany after the war.
The process was slow, but the seeds of change were being planted. Yet, even as some prisoners began to rethink their beliefs, others refused to change. Hard-line Nazi loyalists continued to watch their fellow prisoners carefully. Anyone who seemed too friendly with Americans or too curious about democracy could still attract suspicion. The ideological struggle that had begun inside the camps was far from over. But outside the fences, in the open fields of America, many prisoners were already experiencing something that would shape their lives long after the war ended. For the first time, they were seeing a different kind of society, one that relied less on fear and control and more on ordinary people working together. And that quiet realization would follow them all the way back to a shattered Germany.
By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing just as dramatically as it had begun years earlier. Allied armies pushed deep into German territory from the west, while the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. Cities across Germany lay in ruins after years of bombing. Railways were destroyed, factories were silent, and millions of civilians struggled to survive among the rubble. Inside the prisoner of war camps in the United States, German prisoners followed the news closely. Rumors moved through the barracks faster than official announcements. Some prisoners refused to believe the reports at first. Others quietly accepted what now seemed inevitable. The Third Reich was falling apart. In April 1945, word spread that Adolf Hitler was dead. Only weeks later, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied powers. The war in Europe was over. For the prisoners in America, the announcement created mixed emotions. Some felt relief that the fighting had finally stopped. Others felt fear about what waited for them back home. Germany had been their world, and now that world no longer existed in the form they had known. Yet, even after the surrender, the prisoners did not immediately return home. Transporting hundreds of thousands of men across the Atlantic again would take time. Ships were busy bringing American soldiers back from Europe and the Pacific. Rebuilding the devastated infrastructure of Europe was also a massive challenge. So the prisoners remained in the camps, sometimes for many months after the war ended. During this period, the American authorities expanded educational programs inside the camps. They introduced newspapers, lectures, and discussions designed to explain the political changes taking place in Germany. Films about the destruction caused by the war and the crimes of the Nazi regime were sometimes shown to the prisoners. For many of them, the information was shocking. Some prisoners had never heard about the concentration camps or the full scale of the regime's atrocities. Others had heard rumors but refused to believe them during the war. Now they were confronted with evidence that forced them to reconsider everything they had been taught. Not everyone accepted these revelations easily. A number of prisoners continued to deny the reports or blamed the disasters on propaganda from the Allies. But others began to reflect more deeply on the path that had led Germany into catastrophe. Months passed as the world slowly adjusted to peace. Finally, the long journey home began. Groups of German prisoners were transported back to ports on the American coast. From there, they boarded ships that carried them across the Atlantic once again. But this time, the journey felt very different from the first crossing. When they had arrived in America years earlier, they had been soldiers of a powerful army. They believed they would one day return to a victorious nation. Now they were returning to a defeated country that lay in ruins. When the ships reached European ports, many prisoners struggled to recognize the landscapes they had once known. Cities that had once been filled with life were now fields of broken buildings and empty streets. Bridges had been destroyed, factories were collapsed, and entire neighborhoods had disappeared beneath piles of rubble. For some returning prisoners, the shock was overwhelming. Berlin,
Hamburg, Cologne, and many other cities had been heavily bombed. Families had been separated. Millions of people were homeless. The political system that had dominated Germany for more than a decade had completely collapsed. The men who stepped off the ships were no longer soldiers of the Third Reich. They were simply survivors returning to rebuild their lives. For many of them, the years spent in American camps had quietly changed the way they saw the world. They had lived in a country where ordinary citizens openly criticized their leaders. They had seen a political system where elections, debates, and independent newspapers were part of daily life. They had experienced treatment that contradicted the propaganda they had believed during the war. Some prisoners later described the camps as an unexpected classroom. Instead of harsh punishment, they had encountered something far more powerful, a different example of how a society could function. The exposure to American culture, work, and education had planted questions in their minds that many continued to explore after returning home. Historians would later describe this experience as one of the most unusual chapters of the war. Around 400,000 German prisoners had lived inside the United States during World War II. They worked on farms, played sports in camp fields, read books in camp libraries, and watched a country at war continue to function with remarkable stability. Many of them returned to Germany carrying memories that challenged the worldview they once held. Some would later help rebuild the democratic institutions of post-war Germany. Others would simply remember their captivity as a strange period when enemies treated them with fairness they had not expected. Years later, a number of former prisoners even returned to the United States, visiting the small towns where they had once worked as laborers during the war. What they remembered most was not the fences or the guard towers. It was the surprising humanity they had encountered in a place they once believed to be their enemy. The American prisoner of war camps had been called many things by historians. Some described them as comfortable prisons. Others called them a social experiment in the middle of a global conflict. But one idea appears again and again in the memories of the men who lived there. Sometimes the most powerful way to challenge an ideology is not through force or punishment. Sometimes it begins with something far simpler: a meal shared across a table, a conversation in a field, or a prison camp where the fence was not as strong as the ideas waiting beyond it.